Drogon circled the ruined city for hours before he descended onto the scorched remains of the Red Keep, his enormous wings casting shadows long enough to stretch across an entire district of King's Landing. The sky was still choked with a lingering smell of smoke, ash, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Even the sea breezes rolling in from Blackwater Bay did little to cleanse the air. High above the streets he hovered in an angry swirl of dust and wind, an apex creature that commanded both awe and terror. But beneath his powerful roars, something like sorrow lingered. It manifested not in the noise he made but in the deliberate precision of his every move. Even as he roared at the clouds, as if furious that they offered no comfort, he appeared lost. His mother, Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen, was gone. The Iron Throne, the symbol of her life's pursuit, stood below in the Great Hall, silent and charred. The city was ruined by the devastation she had unleashed with Drogon's very own flames. Neither could stand unscathed by what had happened. The last time Drogon had been here, he had melted the Iron Throne in a moment of ferocious grief, unleashing a torrent of dragon fire so intense that the seat of power had turned into a molten sculpture of contorted steel. Its shape had run like hot wax, dripping and cooling, a slow and grotesque spectacle that had left an indelible mark on the Great Hall's ancient stone floor. Walls that had once sheltered kings and queens for centuries were blackened by the intense heat, but they still stood, stoic in their partial destruction. The pillars remained tall but cracked. Their every fissure was testimony to the pain and betrayal that had led to such cataclysmic fury. Where once men and women had gazed upon a seat of swords with reverence or ambition, there was now a lumpy, incomplete mass of jagged, twisted metal. The city had not returned to normal. How could it? Too many had died. The acrid odor of burning flesh had long since dissipated, but the memory haunted those who remained. The hush that had fallen after Daenerys' final battle was not a peaceful silence. It was merely the absence of continued carnage, a tension that settled in the rubble, in the empty spaces of what used to be thriving streets. The sun set each day over ruin, and each sunrise seemed to cast light on unending gloom. In the days and weeks since that last confrontation in the throne room, rumors had run rampant across the Seven Kingdoms. Some said Drogon had carried Daenerys' body to Volantis, or to Old Valyria, or into the very heart of the Dothraki Sea, where he would place her remains high upon a mountain of bones. Others claimed he roamed the skies aimlessly, scanning the land below for some sign or vestige of his mother's spirit. Speculations grew into legends almost overnight. And then, as if drawn back by a beacon of memories and heartbreak, he returned to King's Landing, to the place where so much of Daenerys' dream had died with her. What compelled him to land on the remnants of the Red Keep was anyone's guess, for who could presume to understand the mind of a dragon? Yet he came down in the very courtyard where once Daenerys had stood triumphant. One great swipe of his claws scattered loose stones from the ruined battlements. Another wingbeat whipped dust and ash around in a furious swirl. He roared, a sound that reverberated through the hollowed halls and broken towers like a thunderclap from an unforgiving god. The few souls still lingering in the city ran or hid, uncertain if a new wave of dragonfire would befall them. But no new onslaught came, only the sound of his labored breath and the scrape of his claws against stone. For a time, Drogon just stood there, the curvature of his spine rising and falling with each breath, his enormous ribcage expanding and contracting like bellows. Beneath the black scars on the once immaculate floors of the throne room lay the cooled remnants of molten swords, congealed into something shapeless and ugly. Drogon pressed his snout close to it, sniffing in a way that seemed almost tender. The metal was lifeless and cold, but he recognized it by scent, steel, and the faint tang of leftover heat. Some part of him knew that this had once been the seat of his mother's aspirations, a seat that had cost her everything. Perhaps in the savage yet astute instincts of a dragon, he had come to sense that this pile of slag was the root of so much ruin. With something like determination, he drew his head back, filling his lungs, then exhaled a fresh wave of fire. The column of flame lit the broken ceiling in shimmering flashes of orange and yellow. Sparks flew in wild arcs, and the metal again glowed like a freshly stoked forge. The heat trickled across his scales, but he did not relent. If there was any shred of the Iron Throne left, he would see it destroyed entirely. When he finished, what remained was barely recognizable as anything more than molten lumps. But that was not the end. He drew back his great head and seemed to stare at it, turning it over in his mind, or whatever served as a mind for a creature both savage and majestic. Then, with a swift and deliberate motion, he placed one massive claw against the searing metal, ignoring the hiss of heated scales. He dragged the molten mass across the floor with slow, measured pulls, as if shaping and stretching it into something new. A wave of shock rippled through the few onlookers who had gathered, half hidden behind broken columns or peering through gaps in the walls. Drogon was forging, though none could say how or why. Maybe he was fueled by the memory of Daenerys' wish to break the wheel, to create a new order that she believed would be gentler and more just, even if her final acts betrayed that vision. Or maybe it was a dragon's own whim, a primal, inexplicable act that would spawn countless stories but only partial truths. Word spread like wildfire. The creature was building something in the ruins of the Iron Throne. Some said he was forging a monument to Daenerys. Others whispered he was creating a lair. But curiosity grew too strong to be contained by fear. A small circle of onlookers stayed at a cautious distance, watching over the course of many days as Drogon returned again and again to shape the molten metal, reheating it when necessary, scrounging from the piles of swords still embedded in the rubble of the throne room's collapsed ceiling. In those piles were the remnants of weapons that had once been hammered into the throne itself by Aegon the Conqueror's smiths. Drogon gathered them, or perhaps recognized them, and fused them into the growing mass. He used his fire to melt them down and his claws to shape them, each monstrous footfall shaking the halls until new fissures crisscrossed the floor. In time, the object began to take a coherent form. Gone were the jagged lines of swords welded into a throne. Instead, Drogon's claw marks etched curved walls, archways, and wide open spaces. Observers started to refer to it as a shell, or framework, uncertain of its purpose. Some brave or, perhaps, foolhardy souls crept closer in the dark of night to catch a better glimpse. More than a few burnt corpses littering the approach served as a warning. Not everyone who tried to see Drogon's work up close was allowed to walk away. But the sense of terror no longer felt as raw as it had in the days of Daenerys' siege. The city's survivors, left with little but ruin, felt more curiosity than dread. They wanted to see if this monstrous beast was conjuring something terrible or forging a new tale that might bring hope, or at least meaning to the endless rubble. During the day, the clang of metal against stone, the roar of dragonfire, and the low rumble of Drogon's growls formed a symphony of reconstruction. By dusk, the metal skeleton took on new layers of intricacy. Broad arches rose from the main dais of the ruined throne room. The dais itself expanded into a circular stage of rippled steel, molten lumps hammered into shape by the force of Drogon's mighty claws. The corners of the old hall, long overshadowed by the monstrous shape of the Iron Throne, now opened into wide corridors, spaces that seemed designed for gathering rather than intimidation. It was as though Drogon was creating a large circular pavilion with multiple entrances, not a solitary seat upon which one person could rule, but a place many could occupy. One crisp morning, the watchers noticed how Drogon had meticulously carved a set of steps that led down into what had once been the darkest part of the throne room, near the side corridors that extended to the Targaryen family's private chambers. Step by step, using the heat of his breath and the dexterity of his claws, he shaped a dais unlike any that had graced the halls before. The dais bore a broad open platform at its center, ringed by a series of curved benches. It looked almost like an amphitheater, a place where people might gather to speak rather than kneel. Instead of a single seat, there were many. Instead of an elevated dais meant for one ruler, the design welcomed a circle of seats looking inwards. If there had been master builders left in King's Landing with the inclination to approach, they might have recognized the primal outline of a forum, a physical structure encouraging dialogue and debate, not solitary commands. Drogon continued to shape this structure over weeks. He was tireless, as though a hidden purpose drove him. The watchers began to notice patterns in the angles and arcs. Symbols of House Targaryen were visible at certain vantage points, twin arcs that suggested a dragon's wings, swirling shapes like dancing flames. But it was subtler than the blatant, throne-like display of power that had dominated the Great Hall for centuries. This new creation held a kind of airy openness. The metal frames had been polished by repeated blasts of fire, glimmering in the sunlight like hammered silver. At dawn, the entire structure caught the sun's rays and sparkled with a brilliance that felt almost hopeful. By moonlight, it glowed darkly, reflecting starlight with a subdued shine that invoked awe more than fear. As the structure neared its final stages, an air of uneasy anticipation gripped King's Landing. People were starving, still reeling from war. There was no functioning government, no council, and no queen. Bran Stark had been chosen king in the immediate aftermath of Daenerys' downfall, but his rule was fragile and remote in the eyes of many common folk in the city. The scars were too fresh. Yet no one dared challenge Drogon or attempt to tear down this architectural marvel under construction. Armed men ventured into the city from time to time, but they kept their distance from the Red Keep. It belonged to the dragon now. Rumors spread that the Unsullied had departed Westeros, that the Dothraki had wandered off, either to sail back to Essos or to wreak havoc in the nearby countryside. The Lannisters were in no shape to reassert power, being all but extinguished. Queen Cersei was gone. Jaime was gone. Tyrion was on some mission for the new king. In the midst of such emptiness, Drogon's forging became the focal point for all eyes. One day, seemingly satisfied with the steel edifice, Drogon perched atop a tall, twisted spire that had once been a corner tower of the Red Keep. He studied his creation from on high, wings partially unfurled like a gargoyle in vigil. The battered hall below held a structure both ancient and new, a place with arches wide enough for many people to enter, an open central circle where voices would echo and carry. In some ways, it resembled the Colosseum of Volantis or the fighting pits of Meereen. But it had an air of solemnity, as though shaped by a desire for discourse rather than violence. And indeed, people began to enter it, cautiously at first, drifting in small groups across the rubble-strewn courtyard. They found the new arrangement of steel seats in a ring around a central floor. Some stood and stared at the hammered floor, which still glimmered in places where the dragon's fire had smoothed the metal to mirror-like polish. At first, the crowds who gathered within the structure were too meek to speak above whispers. Perhaps they feared Drogon's wrath, or perhaps the echoing quiet of the place evoked a sense of reverence. Then, as the days crawled onward, a few bolder voices rose. A man whose family had been killed by falling rubble during the siege began to lament his losses. His grief poured out in sobs that filled the amphitheater's curved walls. No searing dragonfire silenced him. Others joined in, voicing their despair, questioning why everything had fallen apart. Day after day, more survivors arrived to vent their pain, their grievances against the old ways of the Seven Kingdoms, the cruelty of kings and queens who demanded homage and taxes while the small folk starved or died in wars they had not chosen. The amphitheater's acoustics were surprisingly excellent. Every cry, every uttered word resonated as though the structure itself carried them to every ear. Weeks of this turned into a rudimentary form of communal gathering. A few scattered officials, lesser lords who had not been killed or who had no immediate stake in the new regime, appeared and tried to address the throngs. They were often shouted down, questioned, or simply ignored. The hush that had stifled King's Landing was slowly replaced by a clamor of voices. Stories of suffering, anger, and an urgent need for direction filled the space. Drogon watched from the high vantage points, shifting his weight on splintered stone towers. He never interfered, except on a few occasions when tempers flared dangerously, and men drew weapons. Then the dragon descended with a menacing hiss, or a brief puff of flame near the transgressors' feet, sending them scurrying. It was as though the beast had turned from the city's greatest threat to its reluctant guardian of peace. Those who dared approach Drogon more closely, sometimes children, sometimes the desperate, found he would not harm them unless they showed aggression. They would leave small offerings of food or tokens, old Targaryen coins, a dragon's tooth from some fossil, or scraps of cloth embroidered with the sigils of houses long gone. He seemed uninterested in these gestures, except occasionally to poke at them curiously before turning away with a snort. Some of the more imaginative onlookers whispered that Drogon was waiting for something, for a sign that the people he had left behind would build a world worthy of Daenerys' original dream. Others scoffed that attributing such purpose to a dragon was folly, but still they came to the steel amphitheater in greater numbers. One late afternoon, a single man stood in the center of the forum. He was no one of particular renown, just an older mason named Tommen, ironically sharing a name with a former boy king, but unrelated to any Lannister. With a loud, quavering voice, he addressed the milling crowd about the urgent need for shelter and food. Winter might not have been as harsh in King's Landing, but the city was in ruins, crops were destroyed, and shipments from other regions were inconsistent. He asked if there were farmers among them, or traders, or even beggars who had gleaned from the fields. One by one, people raised their hands, stepping forward, drawn by the sense that here in the echoing circle of steel benches, they might find a place to actually speak and be heard. They began to exchange ideas, pooling scraps of knowledge. Where to find unspoiled farmland outside the city, how to rebuild irrigation ditches, which gates in the city walls still stood passable. A woman named Farah recounted how her village in the Reach had coped with droughts by constructing rudimentary dams along a tributary. Some ex-soldiers offered to help dig new channels, if only they had tools. Others promised that metal could be salvaged from the heaps of broken swords and armor scattered across the battlefield outside the city. Scribes, formerly in service to the old bureaucracies, brought quills and ink, copying down lists of volunteers and needed supplies. The crowd grew as the conversation continued for hours, fluidly, sometimes erupting in arguments, but more often blossoming into cooperative planning. The entire time, Drogon perched near a battered spire, silhouetted against the setting sun, silent and watchful. In the days that followed, the Forum, so people began calling it, became a daily meeting ground. A group of volunteers swept away rubble and set up a makeshift schedule for discussions. The mornings were reserved for immediate concerns: water, shelter, medical aid for the wounded. Around midday, a group of refugees from Essos spoke about bridging cultures, offering up whatever they knew of trade routes. In the evening, the floor opened to general grievances, announcements, or even performances by traveling minstrels who sought to lighten the grim mood. No one had formally organized these activities, but the energy of collaboration carried them forward. The threat of Drogon's presence enforced a minimal code of conduct, no outright violence. Word of the new forum spread beyond King's Landing, traveling with displaced peasants and free folk from the south. Soon men and women from other corners of Westeros trickled in, drawn by rumors that a dragon-guarded assembly now welcomed anyone with a mind to speak and contribute. The concept, outlandish though it was in a land so accustomed to top-down rule, had a certain irresistible appeal. The late Queen Daenerys had once promised a world without tyrants, though her final actions had made that promise ring hollow. But here was something that, in an odd and unplanned way, felt like a step toward that dream. There was no single leader on a throne of swords. Instead, there was an open circle of seats that invited any voice to be raised. The more practical-minded citizens began to set up stalls around the periphery of the forum. Bakers brought what little bread they could spare and sold or traded it. Seamstresses displayed patched garments, tailors mended armor and clothes. A rough-and-tumble barter economy emerged, unregulated but seemingly guided by the watchful gaze of the enormous dragon perched on high. Children ran in the courtyard, sometimes pausing to stare up at Drogon with a mixture of fear and fascination. He would occasionally crane his neck down, studying them, his nostrils flaring. If a child stepped too close, he might let out a low rumble, more warning than threat, and the child would scurry back. Yet no one doubted that if any vile act were attempted, Drogon's wrath would be immediate. The structure, once the seat of monarchy's power, was now a communal area ringed by a single draconic enforcer. Strangely, it granted everyone there a sense of tenuous security. The gatherings grew more structured over time. Certain individuals emerged as respected voices: Liliane, a healer who had treated countless wounded during the siege; Bryn, an ex-soldier with a knack for organizing volunteers; and Estevan, a traveling merchant with a golden tongue who mediated disputes with a surprising gift for impartiality. Many nights, they found themselves at the center of the forum, facilitating discussions on how best to distribute resources or how to approach the lords of neighboring domains for trade. It was not a government in any formal sense. There were no decrees signed by a king's hand or sealed with a great house sigil. Yet it was something new, fragile and alive. A civic body formed from the ashes. One evening, an emissary from King Bran arrived. A tall, cloaked figure escorted by a small detachment of guards, he introduced himself simply as Maester Jonel. Standing in the center of the forum, he observed the ring of battered survivors, the improvised seats, the charred backdrop of the once regal Red Keep. Then he caught sight of Drogon, curled along the top of the highest surviving tower, and his expression flickered with alarm. The crowd quieted it as they watched him swallow his nerves. For so many, the presence of an official messenger from the new king rekindled old wariness. Would this be an attempt to reassert traditional monarchy over the city? Maester Jonil announced that King Bran had heard rumors of a dragon building a new structure where the Iron Throne once stood. The king was curious and concerned about these developments. He questioned whether the city was stable, whether the dragon posed a threat, and whether assistance was needed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The older patterns of subservience to the crown had not been entirely forgotten, but a defiance also brewed here. People had found a measure of autonomy and unity within these walls. Still, they needed all the help they could get to rebuild. Liliane, the healer, stepped forward, a short woman with determined eyes. She spoke of the devastation, the hunger, and the illness that still plagued many citizens. She explained how the Forum had become a place where people could gather to coordinate relief efforts, to distribute meager supplies and share knowledge. The moment she mentioned Drogon, the crowd's eyes flicked upward. The dragon was watching, unblinking. Liliane explained that the dragon had not harmed them during these gatherings and, in fact, seemed to enforce peace, keeping open conflict at bay. Bryn added that none had come forward as a self-declared ruler. The Forum had no single leader, only a system of open discourse, with a few volunteers helping to maintain some semblance of order. Where once an iron seat of swords had loomed, now stood a communal circle of steel benches that Drogon himself had shaped from the remains of that cursed throne. It was, in a sense, a gift, though a frightening one, given its source. Maester Jonil listened, his eyebrows knitting together thoughtfully. He cast glances at his guards, who stood tensely at the Forum's outer edges, clearly uneasy in the presence of so many ragged but impassioned townsfolk. He asked them if King Bran's official laws were being observed, about theft, assault, or the paying of taxes. Estevan, the traveling merchant, responded with a wry chuckle that the people here had lost so much, they had no coin to pay taxes. Everything was being rebuilt through barter and shared labor. As for laws, they enforced what needed to be enforced for mutual survival. No violence within the Forum, no hoarding of essential supplies, no exploitation of the wounded. Beyond that, they had little time or inclination to worry about the decrees from the capital. This was the capital, after all, or it had been. Now it was just a city of ruins, trying to rediscover how to live. The Maester sighed and proposed that a formal representative be chosen to speak for this Forum to the crown. He insisted on traveling with that representative back to Bran's seat of power, currently in the Red Keep's less damaged wings, or possibly in the old Tower of the Hand, where improvised repairs were underway. The crowd began to murmur. Who would they send? Bryn was a soldier, well-spoken enough but prone to bluntness. Liliane was a healer, respected for her compassion, but too busy saving lives to go and speak with kings. Estevan seemed the obvious choice, but his background as a merchant made some suspicious that he might favor certain trades or deals. Others suggested a rotating group of volunteers. The argument started to heat up. Voices rose, echoing against the curved steel walls, and tensions crept in as each faction or interest group wanted to ensure they were represented fairly. Then came a roar that shook dust from the rafters. Drogon spread his wings and leapt from the tower's peak, landing with a thunderous impact on the courtyard. His black scales caught the dying light of day, shimmering with subtle undertones of red and gold, a living furnace of muscle and might. People scattered back, shrinking to the edges of the Forum. The guards gripped their spears, but Maester Jonil raised a trembling hand to signal them not to provoke the dragon. Drogon swung his head around, glaring from one face to another. His pupils narrowed. With a deep, rumbling hiss that rattled the steel benches, he slithered forward until his massive body coiled near the center stage. A hush fell, so absolute that the distant call of gulls from Blackwater Bay seemed to echo like thunder. No one knew what the dragon intended. A flash of fear coursed through them, the memory of that unstoppable fury that had toppled cities. But Drogon merely laid his bulk across the newly forged circle, his tail coiling around a twisted column of stone, effectively blocking half the entrances. He gave a final snort, smoke curling from his nostrils, and then went still. His message was unmistakable. No one was leaving this place while the argument raged. They had to find another way to resolve the issue. Tension gave way to a nervous but determined sense of resolution. Esteban stepped forward and spoke in a calm, clear voice. He proposed that a small council be chosen rather than a single representative, perhaps 3 individuals who carried the trust of the people here. He volunteered to be one, acknowledging that he knew trade routes and foreign contacts. He suggested Lillian be another, to represent the common folk and their needs, since she was intimately aware of the city's suffering. For the third, he proposed Bryn, who understood what was needed to maintain basic security and coordinate labor. The crowd deliberated. Some were hesitant, but many saw the sense in having a triad of voices with complementary skills. There were no official votes, only a cacophony of agreement or dissent shouted across the forum. Finally, consensus formed around these 3, Esteban, Lillian, and Bryn. Drogon, as though sensing the shift in tone, rumbled once more. Then he stood, turned away, and leapt into the sky in a powerful surge of wings, stirring a swirl of dust and debris that made everyone shield their faces. They stared after him, marveling at his silhouette against the orange sky. The abruptness of his departure left an odd feeling: relief, awe, maybe gratitude. They turned back to the maester, who nodded his acceptance of this triad. They would accompany him to King Bran, state the forum's aims, and return with any proposals from the crown. The following day, the newly formed council of 3 prepared to leave. They walked through the battered streets, stepping around shattered masonry and burned timbers, escorted by Maester Jonal's guards. Onlookers wished them luck, some offering what little gifts they could spare for the journey. The group climbed the slope to the older, less damaged part of the Red Keep, passing broken gates and scorched walls, until they reached a makeshift guard post. Soldiers loyal to King Bran, bearing a new sigil, a weirwood tree on a field of white, if rumors were correct, allowed them through with minimal fuss. Within the fortress's battered interior, they finally found the new king. Bran Stark sat in an austere room furnished with whatever had survived the chaos. He was attended by a few knights, scribes, and advisors, among them Tyrion Lannister, who had visibly aged since the war's end. The moment Esteban, Lillian, and Bryn set eyes on Bran, they saw a youth not in body, for he had grown from the boy he once was, but in the overshadowed gaze that seemed to stare beyond them, as though he looked into another realm. He welcomed them with a polite nod, his voice measured. Tyrion introduced them formally, and explained that King Bran was eager to learn more about what was happening in the heart of the city. This forum was intriguing, but the realm needed stability. Would their new structure challenge, or support the crown's efforts to keep the peace and rebuild? Lillian spoke first, describing the dire conditions and how the forum had become a place where people of all walks of life gathered to share resources and knowledge, with the unspoken oversight of Drogon. She insisted that their aim was not to overthrow or supplant the crown, but to help the people, who had lost so much faith in the old ways. Bryn spoke of how the presence of the forum had reduced conflict in the streets, fewer thefts, fewer acts of violence. The forum's discussions had led to small but meaningful rebuilding efforts, such as clearing rubble to plant gardens in the city's outskirts. Esteban emphasized that the forum could become a cornerstone of a new, more inclusive order in King's Landing. He pointed out that if the crown supported this endeavor, it could help mend a rift between the monarchy and the small folk, forging alliances from the ground up, rather than from the top down. Tyrion listened closely, occasionally glancing at Bran for his reactions. At one point, Tyrion remarked with a faint smirk that he never thought a dragon would become the champion of a people's assembly in Westeros, that it was a concept more likely to spring from the free cities. Yet here they were, in the ashes of the Targaryen dream, forging something unprecedented. He asked about Drogon's temperament, whether the dragon was truly under anyone's control. Bryn responded bluntly that Drogon was not controlled by anyone. He responded to threats with lethal force, but so long as the forum remained peaceful, he was content to watch. No one truly commanded him now. Bran spoke softly, his voice measured, as if weighed with the knowledge he bore. He recalled that Drogon had taken Daenerys' body away, and no one knew if she was truly gone or if there was some ritual at play. The king's vacant yet intense gaze rested on each of them in turn. He then stated that a new order could not be built on fear alone. However, the forum sounded like it was functioning not on fear but on cooperation, despite the presence of Drogon. This intrigued him. He proposed a trial period. The crown would provide limited supplies, grain, building materials, and some healing herbs. In return, the forum would organize distribution and keep record of how it was used, so a fair portion of the city's inhabitants benefited. If the forum succeeded, perhaps it could be a model for other cities in Westeros. He stressed that unity, not revolt, was the aim. The trio exchanged glances, relief evident in their eyes. They were not being dismissed or charged with sedition. With Tyrion's guidance, they drafted an informal agreement. The crown would send small shipments of grain and stone to aid reconstruction. The forum would ensure it reached the needy and would keep the peace in the city's core. Beyond that, the crown would simply observe and see if this novel experiment bore fruit. It was a precarious alliance, but it was a start. Tyrion raised a quill and wrote carefully, the scratch of ink on parchment echoing in the makeshift hall. As they sealed the deal, the distinct noise of Drogon's roar drifted through the broken corridors, faint but unmistakable. A wry, weary smile curved Tyrion's lips. It seems our draconic friend does not like to be forgotten, he mused. Then he handed the sealed parchment to Estevan, who tucked it into his cloak. In the weeks after that, small caravans began to arrive at the edges of King's Landing, carrying sacks of grain, timbers for rebuilding, and crates of supplies. They bore the new King's Mark, and the forum's volunteers, newly christened Forum Stewards, coordinated how these supplies were distributed. They needed to remain vigilant, as old habits of corruption and hoarding died hard. Greedy men tried to intercept the caravans or bribe the stewards. Those who attempted thievery often found themselves confronted by ex-soldiers loyal to the forum, or in the worst cases, a sudden rush of air overhead heralding Drogon's watchful intervention. The knowledge that a dragon might appear if unrest grew too great curbed many ill intentions. As rebuilding efforts progressed, something extraordinary began to take shape. The forum itself evolved beyond crisis management into a crucible for local governance. They formed committees, though no one dared call them that at first. One group tackled sanitation, removing refuse and burying corpses still trapped under collapsed buildings. Another handled agricultural efforts, working with the outskirts of the city to plant new crops or salvage old fields. Others set up basic schooling for children orphaned by the war, teaching them letters, numbers, and the rudiments of trade. It was chaotic, disorganized, and rife with challenges, but each step in the forum was taken in open discussion. Decisions were argued for or against, not dictated from on high. Some lords who returned to the city were skeptical, even dismissive. They saw these gatherings as rabble-rousers, people stepping above their station. A handful tried to assert their traditional rights, to tax those living on what they considered their lands. Their claims were often met with fierce debate, shouts, and finally, in some cases, the imposing presence of Drogon overhead. Realizing that pushing their feudal privilege too far in this environment might result in a short, fiery demise, they backed off, albeit grudgingly. They recognized that times had changed. This new dynamic born from ashes was not so easily undone. At night, the forum became an almost sacred space. Torches lined the steel arches, casting dancing shadows on the twisted metal. Citizens would bring flasks of soup or ale to share, sitting on the cool steel benches. They took solace in conversation, in forging new bonds of fellowship. Harpists and drummers appeared, performing melancholy laments for those lost to war, and uplifting tunes for the promise of renewal. Children played games in the ring, skipping on the patches of smooth metal. Elders would reminisce about days before the wars. Healers tended to the frail in makeshift tents around the edges. Sometimes, a hush would descend, and all eyes would lift to the gloom overhead, where Drogon's outline might appear against the stars, wings spread wide, as if he were on a perpetual patrol around the city he had once terrorized. In the quiet corners of dusk, whispers spread about the deeper meaning of this transformation. Why had Drogon built this place? Was it an act of grief, an atonement for Daenerys' fall into tyranny? Perhaps the dragon, in a manner beyond human comprehension, had understood his mother's original vision, to break the tyrannical chain of rulers, to uplift the common folk. Maybe this was his way of honoring that ideal. Or maybe it was merely an animal's instincts, forging a nest out of the remnants of what had been precious to it. No one could say for certain. But as the circle of benches filled each day with voices that rarely had been heard in the halls of power, people began to speak of this phenomenon with reverence. They called it a people's forum, a phrase that sounded radical and new in a land used to kings and lords. Even the old ones who clung to tradition could not deny that something vital and different was emerging here. King Bran's response was cautious acceptance. Through Maester Jonel, he maintained communication with the forum, sometimes sending suggestions or requests for collaboration. Tyrion visited once, accompanied by a handful of guards, to observe the forum in action. He slipped in quietly, his short figure hunched in a cloak. He listened to the spirited debates, nodded thoughtfully as farmers argued with laborers about the best way to distribute the new wheat seeds, and even fielded a question or two about whether House Lannister still owed debts to the city. With his characteristic wit, he retorted that the Lannisters paid their debts, but it seemed fewer Lannisters were left to do so. That drew a tense laugh. During one such visit, Tyrion was forced to confront the living power of a dragon up close. Drogon landed in the courtyard, and for a moment, Tyrion froze, remembering the devastation of the war. But the dragon merely snorted, recognizing Tyrion, perhaps recalling the dwarf who had unchained Daenerys' other dragons in Meereen. With a kind of resigned acceptance, Drogon turned away, letting Tyrion pass. Those who witnessed the moment felt a hush of awe. It was as if the dragon was acknowledging that times had changed, that old grudges and alliances had melted away with the throne's steel. As the seasons shifted from the lingering warmth of late summer to the cooler breezes of autumn, King's Landing began to resemble a city reborn. Scaffolding rose around the perimeter, supporting partial repairs to the outer walls. Teams of laborers hauled rubble away in wagons. Streets once choked with corpses and debris were cleared, allowing some semblance of normal commerce to resume. Where the Iron Throne had loomed, an open amphitheater now stood, hosting daily gatherings that shaped the city's future. Not everything was idyllic. Crime still existed, tensions still simmered. Rival lords tested boundaries. But the forum offered a public space to address grievances, with no illusions that a single speech or decree would solve everything. Governance, the people discovered, was hard work, a daily negotiation, a messy process of compromise and conflict. Yet, for the first time many could recall, they felt part of that process. And presiding over this fragile experiment, Drogon remained. Sometimes he vanished for days, perhaps hunting in the wilderness or soaring across the narrow sea. But he always returned, a silent sentinel perched high on the broken battlements, reminding all who saw him that their new freedom had been bought at a terrible cost. His presence forbade any single faction from seizing power by violence. In a land that had endured countless rulers, swords, and bloody contests for the throne, this was as close to a guardian of peace as one could imagine, albeit a fearsome one. Gradually, some began to speak of formalizing the People's Forum as a permanent institution. They proposed forging actual laws within its circular walls, using scribes to record them, ensuring that the small folk had a voice in how the city was governed. The triumvirate of Estevan, Lillian, and Bryn, now with greater experience under their belts, endorsed the idea. They set about drafting guidelines for how decisions would be proposed, debated, and accepted. It was nowhere near the sophistication of a modern democracy, but it was a radical departure from the hierarchical norms of Westeros. Some older knights and petty lords mocked it as a peasant's folly, certain it would collapse. But the forum's supporters pressed on, spurred by the simple fact that, for the first time, they felt their lives were shaped not by distant lords but by their own hands and voices. With the forum's growing confidence, new tensions arose with the aristocracy. Lord Harroway, a minor noble, who had reclaimed a portion of land near the city, insisted that peasants working on his farms must pay him heavy tribute. When they refused, citing the forum's fair share decrees, he threatened to burn their fields. A delegation of forum stewards confronted him, demanding dialogue. Lord Harroway's men brandished weapons. The standoff escalated until a sky-rending roar announced Drogon's arrival, plummeting out of the clouds in a swirl of black wings and blazing eyes. The Lord's men scattered in panic. Moments later, the Lord stood alone, trembling, as the dragon landed behind the forum delegation. Confronted with that living embodiment of destruction, Lord Harroway capitulated on the spot, stammering out an apology. The forum stewards insisted on forging a more equitable arrangement, a fraction of the harvest as rent rather than an extortionate sum. Reluctantly, Haraway agreed. Word spread quickly that attempting to defy this new order through brute force was unwise. The city had a dragon, and the dragon's loyalty, if it could be called that, seemed to lie with the forum, not with the highborn lords. Yet not everyone believed that a dragon could truly embody justice. Some remembered how Daenerys had turned from liberator to conqueror, and they worried the forum might do the same, seduced by power. The triumvirate took pains to keep open records of their decisions, to rotate spokespeople for major initiatives, and to call open discussions whenever a controversy surfaced. This slowed everything to a snail's pace, but it also built trust. When friction arose over resource distribution, they hashed it out in the forum, with all free to speak. If tempers flared, the memory of Drogon's roar was never far from anyone's mind, urging a more measured approach. Oddly enough, it worked. In a land scarred by war, dragons' flame and tyranny, a slow communal consensus was a welcome change. One autumn morning, under a clear sky tinged with gold, the forging of a new monument began. Not to honor a single ruler or house, but to commemorate the countless commoners who had died over generations of conflict. Blacksmiths worked at the base of the forum, hammering metal salvaged from old weapons. This time, the metal was shaped into something peaceful, a statue depicting a circle of joined hands, peasant hands, soldier hands, craftsman hands, raised together in unity. A simple image, but one laden with significance. Drogon hovered nearby, watching, stirring up the dust with powerful wing beats. Some joked that he might lend his fire to speed the forging. But the smiths preferred to do it by their own labor, forging the statue in a communal effort that symbolized their determination to move forward without relying on the destructive power of flames. As the statue took shape, Bran Stark made a surprise visit. He was carried in on a horse-drawn litter, still unaccustomed to public events in his new role. Tyrion, Brienne of Tarth, and a handful of knights accompanied him. Their arrival startled many, and some braced for confrontation. But the king came in peace, drawn by reports that the People's Forum was becoming more than a curiosity. Tyrion whispered instructions, urging the king to show respect. To everyone's astonishment, Bran requested to enter the forum's amphitheater and speak to the assembled crowd. Word spread quickly, and people poured into the steel-arched structure. Mothers carrying infants, old men with walking sticks, battered soldiers, petty merchants, all crowded the benches. King Bran's retinue stood to the side, arms at the ready but not raised. Even Drogon seemed to sense the moment's gravity, gliding down from his high perch to settle on a broken wall near the forum's top. His black eyes glimmered like coals. The hush that fell was profound. Bran, seated in a simple wooden chair, faced the crowd. He spoke in a voice that was soft but somehow carried. He acknowledged the suffering king's landing had endured, and the failings of those who had claimed power. He spoke of his own unusual path to the throne, of his inability to be a traditional king. He admitted that while he had the gift or curse of seeing into the past and present, that alone did not make him a perfect ruler. He relied on the living voices of the realm to guide decisions. He saw potential in what the Forum had accomplished. It was messy, uncertain, and prone to strife, but it was also the best hope for a future without endless cycles of tyranny. He encouraged them to continue their experiment, to formalize a way for other regions of Westeros to send representatives, to speak for their small folk as well. Perhaps the Forum could become a place where all the lands, North Reach, Stormlands, Iron Islands, Dorne, could send envoys and build an alternative to war. The words carried hope, but also caution. Bran emphasized that forging unity would require patience and compromise on all sides. He concluded by acknowledging Drogon. He was born in fire, shaped by the ambitions of a queen who wanted to remake the world. Now he stands watch over a new order of our making. Let this be a reminder that even the greatest powers can be turned toward creation, not just destruction. No, Jay. The crowd erupted in a murmur that turned into a wave of applause. Some wept openly, recalling the horrors of war and the cyclical violence that had plagued this city for so long. Others stood silent, grappling with the significance of a king who spoke not from a high throne but from a simple chair in a circle of equals. Bran's presence had legitimized them, even if only symbolically. And over them all, Drogon loomed, a constant reminder of the cost of failure. After the king's speech, Tyrion navigated the ring of benches, shaking hands with forum members, discussing logistics for broader involvement. Brienne exchanged respectful nods with the triad of Estevan, Lillian, and Brynn. That day, an unprecedented sense of unity took hold. It wasn't a naive belief that all problems would vanish, but rather a recognition that something genuinely new had begun. No one had quite the words for it: democracy, council rule, or simply a people's forum. Whatever it was, it felt alive and brimming with possibility. As the months wore on, the People's Forum blossomed. Delegates from the Trident, the Vale, and the Reach began arriving in small numbers, curious about this radical experiment. Trade improved. King's Landing slowly shed its scarred visage. Though many buildings still lay in ruin, new homes arose, hastily constructed but built with hope. The Forum expanded its schedule, hosting daily discussions on everything from rebuilding roads to establishing fair courts for disputes. They appointed individuals to travel across the realm, explaining the Forum's purpose and inviting other communities to form their own local assemblies. Resistance abounded. Some lords resented the shift of power, some peasants feared retribution, but momentum grew. Drogon maintained his silent vigil, vanishing for stretches of time, returning to reaffirm that his presence still hung over the city. There were nights when the full moon shone down on his black silhouette perched atop the Forum, and watchers below swore they heard him humming or singing in a low, rumbling tone, as if communing with old ghosts. Superstitious folk claimed he was calling out to Daenerys' spirit, telling her that her dream was, in some manner, coming true, just not the way she had imagined. Others believed he was merely restless, a dragon out of time, uncertain of his place without his mother. Yet, as the People's Forum continued to evolve, some part of that grand Targaryen ambition lived on, now tempered by the collective will of ordinary men and women. The winter that followed was milder than expected, sparing the city. The Forum had organized stockpiles of grain, and though hunger remained a threat, it was far less catastrophic than it might have been. King Bran's supply lines helped, but so did the networks of assistance that the Forum had forged. Spring came, and with it the first signs of real renewal. Fresh blossoms in the newly tilled gardens at the city's outskirts. Children running in half-mended streets. The Forum was constantly alive with debate and clamor, with traveling bards weaving new songs about a city rising from the ashes under a dragon's watchful eye. They called it a city of second chances, where the small folk, once voiceless, had learned to speak. Still, not all corners of Westeros embraced this new order. Murmurs of dissent reached the Forum's ears. Warlords in the distant riverlands, petty tyrants in the stormlands, ex-mercenaries who found the notion of communal rule laughable. Skirmishes flared, villages were attacked. The Forum stewards knew peace was fragile, that any day they might be tested by those who sought to resurrect the old ways through iron and blood. Their best recourse was to continue building alliances, to extend the idea that the People's Forum could be replicated, a chain of assemblies linked in a common cause. They began sending heralds to different regions with letters co-signed by King Bran, inviting local gatherings to decide how best to govern themselves, with the crown serving as a unifying figure rather than an absolute authority. It was unprecedented, radical, and guaranteed to meet resistance. But they persisted. In one notable incident, a band of mercenaries tried to seize the roads leading to King's Landing, hoping to choke off trade and starve the city into submission. The People's Forum organized a militia of volunteers, farmers, blacksmiths, tailors who had learned to handle swords in the chaos of war. They fought back fiercely, fueled by the knowledge that they were defending not a distant king, but their own forum, their own city, their own families. Though the conflict was bloody, they emerged victorious. Drogon appeared in the sky during the battle, but he did not intervene immediately. Only when the mercenaries seemed poised to rally for a last stand did he dive, unleashing a torrent of flame that shattered their morale. Afterward, the surviving mercenaries surrendered. It underscored that while the People's Forum strove for peaceful governance, it was not powerless. The memory of Daenerys' destructive legacy remained a double-edged sword, ironically ensuring the survival of her more benevolent dream. Year by year, the People's Forum solidified its place. Repairs to the Red Keep remained partial. It would never be the same, with whole wings collapsed or burnt beyond repair. But the Forum's amphitheater thrived. Scholars from Old Town visited to study this new form of civic gathering. Some of them penned treatises on people's representation, a concept alien to the Seven Kingdoms. The more religious inhabitants prayed to the Seven, or the old gods, or Urlor, or to any deity they favored, for continued mercy. They decorated the amphitheater's steel arches with ribbons, flowers, and carved wooden icons, an eclectic tapestry of beliefs coexisting in the open air. Through it all, Drogon roamed. He never again forged molten metal or shaped new structures as if his work was done. He was seen soaring far beyond the boundaries of Westeros, and rumors claimed he even visited Essos, flying over the Dothraki Sea, or perching on the ancient ruins of Valyria. But always, he returned to King's Landing, as if tethered by an invisible chain of memory and purpose. His presence remained the final guardian of the Forum, a living deterrent to any who would crush it underfoot. Some whispered that he would vanish for good if ever the People's Forum truly achieved what Daenerys had yearned for, a realm free of tyranny. Others insisted that a dragon never leaves its chosen lair so long as there is prey to be found. The truth was as mysterious as Drogon himself. Amid these ongoing developments, life in King's Landing returned to a semblance of normalcy, albeit a new normal. Children grew up hearing their parents speak not of kings or queens but of the People's Forum debates. Instead of spinning tales of great royal edicts, minstrels sang ballads of the day a dragon melted the Iron Throne and built a forum for the voices of the small folk. They sang of heartbreak and rebirth, of the Targaryen queen's tragic fall, and the wondrous shape her last living child gave to a new hope. Over time, the forum bench seats bore the smooth polish of countless people, sitting and talking, day after day. The stage at the center was scuffed by the footsteps of thousands who dared to stand and speak their mind. Above all, the memory of what tyranny had wrought, symbolized by that molten mass of steel, haunted every decision, cautioning them against repeating history's mistakes. And so the city went on, building a new story in the shadow of dragon wings. Over the horizon, threats inevitably gathered, for Westeros was a land rife with power struggles, ancient grudges, and the relentless churn of destiny. Yet the People's Forum stood as a testament that even in a place as riddled with war and betrayal as King's Landing, a seed of hope could take root and begin to grow. In time, no one knew what shape this fragile experiment might take, whether it would flourish into a true continent-wide assembly of free voices, or whether it would collapse under its own contradictions. But for now, it endured. Each night, the glow of lanterns in the amphitheater lit the forum like a beacon, visible for miles, proclaiming that at least here, amid the twisted ruins of swords and crowns, people tried to shape their own fate. At the close of another day, after the final meeting of the forum had ended and the metal seats were empty, a single figure remained. An old woman, once a maid in the Red Keep, now gray-haired and stooped, walked slowly across the echoing circle of steel. She placed her trembling hand on the cool metal, remembering how she had scrubbed the floors in the time of King Robert, how she had cowered beneath the columns when Daenerys' dragonfire scorched the city. Now, she stood in a place shaped by that same dragon, repurposed from the very swords that had once enforced a single ruler's will. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the polished steel. She closed her eyes and prayed to the Seven, or perhaps to the nameless gods of change, that this time it would be different, that the People's Forum, the city, and all who dwelled here might chart a kinder future. Above, the vast sky stretched dark and infinite. Somewhere in that night, Drogon flew, or perched, or dreamed. The wind carried the faint echo of a dragon's roar, a sound that once heralded conquest, but now lingered as a watchful reminder that from the fires of devastation, something new can be forged, if the people have the will and the courage to shape it. And so King's Landing, cradled beneath the broken battlements of the Red Keep, stirred with the promise of another dawn, forging its path in the heart of a realm that had never before trusted the power of the many. The old woman left the forum with a slow shuffle of feet, leaving behind an empty ring of steel that would fill again tomorrow with voices eager to build, to argue, to heal. Thus, the wheel that Daenerys once wanted to break had indeed been shattered, and in its place stood not a single monstrous seat of iron, but a circle wide enough for everyone to stand and speak their truth, guarded by the last living flame of House Targaryen. The old woman's shuffle of footsteps faded down the corridor of steel and stone, leaving the amphitheater vacant under the moonlight. A soft wind traveled through the open arches, a whisper that seemed to carry both memory and promise in its gentle breath. Overhead, Drogon circled once, a silent, black silhouette against the stars, then veered off toward the distant hills. The People's Forum lay still, its curved benches quietly reflecting the pale glow of lanterns that flickered around its perimeter. If any place in the Seven Kingdoms could be said to hold a heartbeat at that hour, it was here. A new pulse born from the ashes of tyranny. At first light, voices began to fill the amphitheater again. Workers who had risen before dawn, laborers newly arrived from outlying villages, scribes bearing scrolls of petitions, everyone converged under the rising sun. The forum was never truly empty for long. By the time the first beams of morning light caught the arches, at least a small crowd gathered to address the pressing concerns of the day. No horns sounded to summon them. They simply came, for in this place, even the smallest voice found an ear willing to listen, if not always agree. Estevan, the traveling merchant who had become one of the forum's recognized counselors, arrived with a weary but determined gait. He had spent the better part of the night in discussions with a band of traders from the Reach who believed the city was hungry for more than just bread. They wanted entertainment, music, art, and the luxuries that had vanished in the wake of war. Estevan was intrigued by the idea of reintroducing culture to King's Landing as part of its healing, but the logistics baffled him. How could they prioritize poetry and theater when hungry families still lined the streets? He approached the circle of seats with a couple of scrolls under his arm. Bryn, the former soldier, stood by a brazier near the center, warming his hands. Though a slight chill lingered, it was more habit than necessity that drew him to the fire. He kept watch on the half-finished statue of joined hands at the amphitheater's edge, symbol of a unity still being tested. Bryn greeted Estevan with a curt nod, his eyes already scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble. Old habits died hard. Even with the city's newfound sense of cooperation, tensions remained. Liliane, the healer, emerged from a shadowed archway a moment later. She carried a small pouch of herbs, her hands smelling faintly of medicinal salves. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed how little sleep she'd gotten. Tending to the wounded and ill was a task that never seemed to end. Even so, her expression was resolute. She joined Estevan and Bryn in the center, and together they looked around at the motley group gathering, a farmer with dirt-caked boots, a blacksmith still bearing soot on his sleeves, a once affluent tailor wearing patched garments, and a host of others who pressed in, some with determined frowns, some brimming with hope. A hush settled over the amphitheater. The day's first speaker stepped into the ring, a gaunt man named Yawl who had arrived from a hamlet in the Crownlands. His voice trembled as he laid out his plea. Raiders were harassing the supply routes, thieves who cared nothing for the king's new order or the forum's attempts at equity. Livestock had been stolen, wagons burned, and people killed for the few barrels of grain they carried. The hamlet could not defend itself. The local lord, what was left of House Rosby's cadet branches, refused to spare men, claiming his coffers were empty. Now Yol turned to the People's Forum, desperate for help. Estevan and Bryn exchanged looks. This was not the first such complaint. Disparate bands of mercenaries and outlaws roamed the outskirts of King's Landing, opportunists feeding on the realm's instability. The old structures of feudal enforcement had never been fully rebuilt, and the Forum, while it held moral authority within the city, had no standing army beyond volunteers. Liliane asked if any had tried to negotiate or reason with these raiders, but Yawl shook his head, tears tracing lines in the dust on his cheeks. They were little better than beasts. Reason was met with a knife. Bryn cleared his throat and spoke, his voice rough. He proposed organizing a rotating patrol, volunteers from the city who would ride out and safeguard incoming supply wagons. But they would need mounts, armor, weapons, all in short supply. Immediately, a handful of voices from the benches objected. One gray-haired woman, a weaver from Flea Bottom, argued that focusing on external patrols would drain the city of manpower needed for reconstruction. Another man, tall and burly, insisted that security was paramount. Without stable supply lines, the city would starve. Debate heated, voices rising in a cacophony that echoed among the steel arcs overhead. In the midst of the clamor, a distant roar reverberated through the morning air. A hush fell. All heads turned skyward. Drogon's immense shape soared above the forum. The sight of him, even after all these months, jolted hearts. He swooped low enough that a gust of wind ruffled the hair and cloaks of everyone below, then ascended again, beating powerful wings that drummed like thunder. Almost as quickly as he appeared, he flew off, heading toward the river. It was as if the dragon had sensed discord and offered a reminder of his watchful presence. The crowd exhaled collectively, subdued. Esteban took the moment of silence to step forward. He urged everyone to work toward a compromise. Some volunteers could rotate in short shifts, ensuring enough labor remained in the city while giving the outlying hamlets the protection they desperately needed. They could coordinate with King Bran's men, those who garrisoned parts of the Red Keep, to see if additional arms or even a few knights could be spared. Murmurs of assent rippled around the circle. It was hardly a perfect plan, but at least a plan existed now. When the debate concluded, stewards began taking names of volunteers. Yul watched with gratitude shining in his eyes. Liliane promised to send a small medical cart with them. If there were wounded beyond the city, they deserve care too. Bryn conferred quietly with a pair of blacksmiths who might be able to forge extra pikes and sword blades. Esteban noted everything on a piece of parchment, mindful that they could bring these needs before Bran's advisors if their own resources fell short. As the crowd dispersed to tackle the endless tasks of the day, the triad of Esteban, Liliane, and Bryn took a moment's respite near the half-finished statue. The joined hands, hammered from old swords and shields, gleamed in the sunlight. The thought struck Liliane that it was a fragile piece they had forged here, like iron at a certain temperature, strong but still capable of bending if not handled carefully. She voiced her concern. How many more of these crises could the Forum handle before people's faith in it began to crack? Bryn didn't reply at first. He stared at the steel hands, his mind drifting to memories of war. Eventually, he said that the test of any ideal was not whether it solved every problem easily, but whether it endured hardship without shattering. Esteban gazed at the statue, struck by how it symbolized the labor and hope of so many. He promised he would travel again to the Reach soon, seeking more trade alliances. If the city thrived economically, that might ease tensions and give them the means to address security. They all agreed that survival and prosperity had to walk hand in hand. Several hours later, Esteban departed King's Landing with a small caravan of wagons bound for Highgarden. Before leaving, he oversaw the final load of linens, crafts, and other wares to be sold or bartered for grain and livestock. Over 24 people accompanied him, all volunteers. Some were skilled negotiators, others simply looked for a better life or the adventure of crossing half the kingdom. Their small convoy rattled through the city's gates, passing rubble-strewn streets that had seen slow but steady rebuilding. On the horizon, the emerald fields of the Reach beckoned. For a while, the journey was uneventful. They camped by small rivers, occasionally passing hamlets that recognized the People's Forum's wagons. Some cheered, others stared warily, as though uncertain whether to trust an assembly that claimed to speak for the small folk. News traveled slowly in the countryside, and not everyone believed in the existence of a dragon-guarded forum that had replaced the Iron Throne with seats for commoners. Around the 5th day, they approached a crossroads near a cluster of windswept hills. There, they encountered their first challenge. A group of disheveled brigands blocked the road, brandishing swords and axes. At their head stood a hulking man with a ragged scar across his jaw. He demanded a toll, everything they carried, or their lives. Esteban emerged from the wagon heart-thumping, but he tried to show no fear. He had negotiated with sellswords before, though he had never faced them without the protection of a powerful house. He raised his voice, explaining they traveled under the sanction of King Bran and the People's Forum, that their goods were meant to support a growing alliance of trade, and that robbing them would not only be a crime but also draw the ire of a certain black-winged enforcer. The brigands snorted in disbelief. Their leader took a step closer, aiming his rusted blade at Esteban's throat. Esteban swallowed, scanning the small group of defenders at his side. A young woman named Savannah gripped a short sword, while 2 men held spears scavenged from old city armories. They were outnumbered. Esteban's only recourse was to keep talking. He offered a compromise, a small portion of their supplies in exchange for safe passage, a gesture of good faith. That was all they could afford. The leader narrowed his eyes, the scar on his jaw contorting into a sneer. Then he turned to glance at his ragged band, most of whom were hungry themselves. He agreed to take the offering of food, a barrel of salted fish and some dried fruit. But as the brigands hoisted their prize onto a horse, one of them grabbed Esteban by the collar, evidently deciding the merchant might fetch a ransom. Savannah cried out, brandishing her sword, and the standoff escalated. Swords scraped from scabbards. Adrenaline spiked. A roar shattered the tension. Overhead, a great shadow descended. Drogon? Estevan's heart soared at the possibility, though he couldn't imagine how the dragon would have known where they were, unless he had been circling somewhere unseen. But as the shape swooped low, a keen eye could see it wasn't Drogon. It was a wyvern of sorts, smaller, with greenish scales and tattered wings, perched on the cliff edge above. The beast shrieked again, though its cry held a weaker resonance than a full-grown dragon. No one had expected to see such a creature in these parts. Confusion rippled through brigands and travelers alike. Some had heard of wild draconian creatures in the remotest corners of Essos, or rumors of smaller hatchlings in the ruins of Valyria, but not here. The shrieking beast eyed them hungrily, perhaps lured by the smell of salted fish. A moment later it launched into a sudden dive, scattering the brigands with swipes of its claws. The scene dissolved into chaos. The brigands outnumbering Estevan's group also had to contend with the wyvern's unpredictability. It tore into one of the outlaws before they could mount a defense. Savannah dragged Estevan away from the fray, urging everyone to retreat. But the horse carrying the stolen barrel reared and bolted, spooked by the shrieking menace. In the ensuing confusion, the brigands' blockade crumbled. Some tried to strike the creature with swords or arrows, but it darted among them with vicious speed. Bodies fell. Estevan's group seized the opportunity to flee, driving their wagons at a breakneck pace around the melee. Only once they were clear of the skirmish did they slow down, breathless and bewildered. Behind them, the wyvern's screams and the panicked shouts of the brigands faded, leaving an eerie silence. Savina turned to Estevan and shook her head, baffled by their unexpected savior, or menace. The merchant could hardly believe what he'd witnessed. Smaller draconic creatures were the stuff of rumor, not a force he'd ever expected to see in Westeros. Had something changed since the birth of Daenerys' dragons? The land's magic, perhaps awakened, might allow such creatures to wander further than they had in centuries. Relieved to be alive, the convoy pressed on, well aware their luck might not hold if they faced another obstacle. They arrived at Highgarden 2 weeks later, greeted by rolling fields of wheat and flowers. The once grand seat of House Tyrell had seen turmoil during the war, but under the stewardship of a distant branch of that old house, now serving King Bran, it was regaining a measure of its former splendor. Sunlight poured over lush gardens, orchards and tall hedgerows that surrounded the castle's broad moat. In the courtyard, Estevan and his company found a wary welcome. With the Tyrells gone, a new castellan named Sir Marance Flowers had been installed. An older knight rumored to be honorable but cautious. He met with Estevan to hear about the People's Forum. Word had reached Highgarden of King's Landing's transformation, and Sir Marance found it both intriguing and alarming. He questioned Estevan closely. Did the Forum truly allow commoners to make laws? Were there no lords controlling it behind the scenes? Estevan admitted that lords participated if they chose, but they held no formal authority over decisions beyond their own influence as individuals. Everything hinged on open debate, consensus, or compromise. Sir Marance mulled this over, stroking his silver beard, then asked about taxes. Estevan sighed. The question always arose. The Forum encouraged each household or local region to contribute fairly to projects for the common good, whether in labor, goods, or coin if they had it. It wasn't so much a tax as a communal pool. This baffled the Castellan. He had grown up believing a lord or a king must decree taxes by law. Still, Highgarden needed trade as much as King's Landing did. The surrounding farmlands produced ample grain and fruit, but the region was short on certain metals, cloth, and skilled laborers. Thus, a cautious arrangement was made. Estevan's wagons would fill with fresh produce to bring back, and in return, the People's Forum would send blacksmiths, carpenters, and possibly stonemasons to help restore Highgarden's outer walls. Sir Marance insisted on official documents, some sign of King Bran's approval. Estevan showed him the sealed parchment from Tyrion Lannister, a letter authorizing the Forum's trade missions. It was enough to ease the Castellan's hesitation. For days, Estevan and his team negotiated details. They walked the fields, meeting farmers who boasted about the yield. The sun overhead seemed gentler in the reach than in King's Landing, as if the land itself breathed easier. By the time the caravan was loaded for the return journey, they had secured enough grain to feed a portion of King's Landing's population through most of the next year's lean months. plus a variety of seeds that might thrive in the Crownland soil. The success buoyed Estevan's spirits. He hoped such alliances could become a template for the entire realm. The return trip proved tense. Memories of the brigands and the wyvern lingered. The roads were quieter this time, perhaps because rumor of the draconic attack had spread, or the outlaws had fled. Whatever the reason, the convoy traveled unmolested. Sivana stayed vigilant, her sword always within reach. One evening, as they camped near a gently flowing stream, she asked Estevan if he believed the world was changing again, that more creatures like that wyvern might appear. Estevan couldn't say, but he thought about Drogon, a solitary juggernaut in the skies over King's Landing. If dragons were truly returning to the world, in any form, it could alter the balance of power in ways unimaginable. They arrived back at King's Landing amid a clamor of voices. The forum bustled more than ever. Stalls had multiplied around the amphitheater, turning the once devastated courtyard into a makeshift market. Musicians played lutes and drums in the open air. Vendors hawked roasted nuts, fresh bread, and even small crafts. The statue of joined hands now stood completed, dedicated in a modest ceremony days earlier. Estevan felt a pang of regret that he had missed the unveiling, but he admired the finished work. Gleaming fingers of steel, each shaped by a different hand, formed a circle at the base of the amphitheater. The symbolic message was clear. Many hands held up the future. Without pausing to rest, Estevan hurried to meet Liliane and Bryn, who were conferring with a group of newly arrived refugees from Essos. They greeted him warmly, though their smiles were tinged with fatigue. News had reached them of more scattered attacks on supply routes, and they had tried to organize a city militia to combat the raiders, with minimal success. The tension within the city, though not explosive, was rising. Some of the old lords resented the forum's influence and whispered among themselves, sowing doubt. Lilian described rumors that a small but vocal faction believed King Bran should dissolve the forum and restore the old hierarchy. So far, the king had made no move to do so, but the threat of sabotage loomed. Eager to share his success, Estevan described the trade agreement with Highgarden. The supplies he had brought back, grain, seeds, and fresh produce, would sustain many people. He also mentioned the possibility of skilled workers traveling to the Reach for paid work, forging a deeper bond. Lilian smiled with relief. Bryn's face took on a grimmer cast. He pointed out that every success made the forum stronger, which also made their detractors more nervous. He glanced up at the parapets of the Red Keep, where the tattered banners of King Bran fluttered in a gentle wind. If a new wave of plotting arose from the city's aristocracy or from ambitious lords outside, how would the forum withstand it? As if to punctuate Bryn's warning, a loud commotion erupted near the amphitheater's entrance. A cluster of men wearing mismatched armor pushed through the crowd. At their center stood a tall, sneering figure with a gold-trimmed cloak, a newly arrived lord named Ellen Caraway. Lord Ellen had inherited a tiny domain north of the Blackwater, but styled himself as something greater. He demanded an audience with the forum's leaders. Liliane and Bryn exchanged uncertain looks and moved quickly to intercept him. Estevan followed. Lord Ellen wasted no time insulting the throng of commoners. He loudly declared that the land his family held contained valuable timber and stone, resources the city would desperately need. He'd come to offer them at a price, one that included a noble title for himself within the new order and a guarantee that the forum would enforce his claims of vassalage over the peasants on his lands. The crowd bristled. The entire point of the forum was to do away with the kind of overlordship he insisted upon. Liliane spoke with measured politeness, explaining that while the forum welcomed trade and fair arrangements, it did not grant or revoke noble titles. As for forcing peasants into vassalage, she reminded him that the city was attempting a new system of cooperation. Lord Ellen scoffed, turning a slow circle to address the onlookers. He promised that if the forum refused his request, he would simply burn the forests and quarry the stone for his own profit elsewhere. The city would be cut off. Did they truly believe their Dragon Alley would intervene in a matter of resource negotiation? He sneered that dragons cared nothing for timber, only for flesh. Outrage rippled through the assembled crowd. But behind the anger, a flicker of uncertainty glinted in many eyes. The forum had moral power, yes, but the entire region's supply of wood and stone might be disrupted by a single obstinate lord. Without those materials, the city's rebuilding would slow to a crawl. People turned to Bryn, who clenched his jaw, searching for words that would neither incite a fight nor concede to blackmail. Then, in the midst of the charged silence, a roar cracked the air like thunder. People scattered, shrieking. Drogon appeared overhead, circling low with terrifying majesty. The rush of his wings sent dust swirling. Lord Ellen, who had been so confident a moment before, paled visibly. He stepped back, cloak snapping in the wind. Drogon descended, landing at the edge of the forum with a force that shook the ground. His black eyes fixed on the intruder. No one spoke. The tension was electric. Even Lillian's heart pounded as she wondered how the dragon would interpret this scene. If violence broke out, Drogon might unleash a wrath none could contain. For an instant she feared an inferno would sweep the courtyard, repeating the horrors of old. But Drogon merely stomped forward, lowered his great head, and unleashed a huff of heated breath that sent pebbles and debris tumbling. Lord Ellen dropped to one knee, perhaps from terror more than reverence. Drogon's eyes glowed with a subtle orange fire in the sunlight. A hush blanketed the crowd. Then the dragon let out a bone-shaking snort and turned aside, as if dismissing the lord as unworthy of further attention. He spread his wings with a single awesome flap, rising back into the sky. Relief mingled with awe as the crowd watched him vanish beyond the broken towers of the Red Keep. Sputtering, Lord Ellen rose to his feet, cheeks flushed. The onlookers stared. Any intimidation he had tried to project was utterly undone. He had been forced to kneel by a dragon's mere presence. Anger seethed in his expression. He barked a curse at the crowd, then whirled on Bryn and Liliane, demanding if they thought themselves above the old traditions of fealty. Bryn answered calmly that they believed in forging alliances based on mutual benefit, not fear. If Lord Ellen wished to trade timber and stone, they would pay him fairly, but they would not enforce any form of serfdom. The tension mounted as Lord Ellen's hand hovered near his sword hilt. The crowd tensed, half expecting a fight, but the memory of Drogon's roar lingered in the air. Ellen finally spat on the ground and stormed away. His retinue of mismatched guards trailed after him, silent and shaken. In the days that followed, rumors spread that Lord Ellen had returned to his lands, vowing revenge. Some speculated he might hire mercenaries or ally with other discontented lords. Others guessed he might cut his losses and wait for the forum to collapse under its own ambition. Either way, the confrontation served as a powerful reminder of the old order's hostility toward the new ways. The People's Forum carried on, buoyed by the knowledge that Drogon's presence granted them breathing room. But for how long? Meanwhile, Liliane faced a new crisis. A sickness had broken out in Flea Bottom. It spread through cramped alleys where sewage still clogged gullies, a fever that seized its victims with chills, coughing fits, and delirium. Each day, more of the afflicted arrived at the hastily erected infirmaries near the forum. Liliane and her fellow healers worked tirelessly, mixing herbs, applying poultices, and isolating the worst cases in an attempt to stop the contagion. The city's still fractured sewer system posed a significant problem. Without proper sanitation, diseases flourished. At the forum's open sessions, the crisis overshadowed nearly every other issue. Artisans and workers debated how best to rebuild the sewer lines. A group of old stonemasons volunteered plans based on what they remembered of King Maegor's labyrinthine tunnels beneath the city. Others argued for a simpler approach, ditches and covered trenches rather than the complex labyrinth. The discussion stretched on for days, each side citing the urgency. Meanwhile, Liliana's infirmaries overflowed, and the stench of illness clung to the air. Even Drogon's daily patrols took a back seat in people's minds as fear of the fever mounted. King Bran's courtiers sent maesters with supplies of potions, but the outbreak only slowly subsided as the healers' efforts and strict quarantines took effect. A half-dozen children succumbed to the illness, along with many elderly. Funerals became a common sight. The forum draped black banners around the amphitheater in mourning. Some whispered that if the city didn't solve its infrastructure problems soon, it would face wave after wave of disease. During one late-night session after more than a week of intense debates, the forum finally arrived at a plan. A brigade of laborers and volunteers, including skilled stonemasons, would begin reconstructing the old sewer lines that ran beneath the city's main thoroughfares. This was no small task. The labyrinth of tunnels was clogged by rubble from the siege and centuries of neglect. Financing would come partly from the trade deals Estevan had secured, and partly from a newly formed civic fund. Households and businesses would contribute a modest share of earnings or produce. The old cynics might call it a tax, but the difference was that decisions on how these funds were used came from open debate at the forum, not from a king's decree. Implementation began swiftly. If the city failed to act, more lives would be lost. Night after night, teams of workers descended into the damp underbelly of King's Landing. Bryn occasionally led them, sword at his side, ensuring that no lurking dangers, human or otherwise, impeded progress. The darkness below told its own story of forgotten wars and hidden passages. Broken skeletons were found in some chambers, rats fled from the torchlight, and collapsed tunnels needed bracing. But the workers persevered. At street level, the rhythmic clank of picks and shovels became a lullaby to those trying to sleep in the battered buildings above. In a particularly deep section of the old tunnels, the diggers uncovered something unexpected, a collapsed arch leading to a wide corridor with elaborate carvings of dragons. Liliane, who had come down to treat a worker injured by a falling stone, lit a torch to inspect the carvings. They depicted a serpent-like dragon entwined with Valyrian glyphs. The swirling script resembled the arcane symbols rumored to be older than recorded history. One of the masons muttered about cursed tunnels, but curiosity got the better of them. Carefully, they pried away stones blocking the corridor. It was large enough for several men to walk abreast. A musty wind exhaled from the darkness, carrying a scent of centuries past. Word of the discovery reached the forum. Some advocated exploring deeper, suspecting they might find lost treasures or artifacts from the Targaryen dynasty. Others warned of hidden dangers, traps, or worse, vestiges of magic best left undisturbed. In the end, the forum decided on caution. A small team, led by Bryn, and accompanied by Liliane and a couple of stonemasons, ventured into the corridor to assess its stability. They lit torches that danced over the carvings, revealing depictions of dragons locked in battle, ancient kings forging swords in living flame, and cryptic symbols of the Valyrian freehold. They came upon a chamber, half collapsed, filled with scattered debris. The faint glimmer of something metallic caught Bryn's eye, a broken chain embedded in the rubble, links as thick as a man's wrist. Torn tapestries that once hung on the walls lay in a rotted heap, their designs lost to time. Liliane's breath caught at the sight of a massive blackened skull propped against a crumbling pillar. Clearly a dragon's skull, though smaller than the ones that had once decorated the throne room. The group exchanged uneasy glances. This place seemed like a shrine or storage for Targaryen relics, sealed off after some past cataclysm. As they pressed deeper, a mild tremor ran through the corridor. Stones loosened from the ceiling, forcing them to retreat. Bryn led the group out, and they collapsed the entrance behind them to prevent an accidental cave-in. The discovery was both haunting and thrilling, a reminder that beneath the new city they were building lay a labyrinth of history, shaped by dragons, tyranny, and secrets. Liliane vowed to bring the matter before the forum, though she suspected many would argue to keep the corridors sealed for safety's sake. While these hidden chambers added an air of mystery, life above ground pushed forward. The sickness in Fleabottom gradually abated, leaving in its wake a mixture of relief and exhaustion. A smaller infirmary remained open to monitor any new cases. The sewer reconstruction proceeded slowly but steadily. Builders formed rotating shifts to clear and reinforce the tunnels. The forum's decision-making process about the distribution of funds, labor, and resources became more refined with each passing week. They began keeping written records of every debate, so future assemblies could learn from past discussions. Scribes scurried around with ink-stained hands, preserving the forum's words. All the while, Drogon continued his pattern of sporadic appearances, mostly circling the city at dawn or dusk, then flying off to parts unknown. He never attacked or interfered unless there was a threat of open violence. Many in the forum, especially the younger generation, started to regard him as a distant but protective force. Some even felt a kind of reverence, lighting small candles at night in the amphitheater, as if paying homage to a dark guardian. Among the older survivors, however, memories of Daenerys' fiery onslaught lingered. They knew how quickly a dragon's fury could shift. A man named Audric, who had lost his wife in the siege, implored the forum not to lean too heavily on Drogon's shadow for security. He argued that reliance on fear of a dragon's wrath, was not so different from the old tyrannies. The city must stand on its own. Odric's words struck a chord with those who valued the Forum's independence. But for many, the threat of raiders, brigands, and vengeful lords was too pressing. They reasoned that without Drogon's presence, the Forum would be attacked and overrun. A precarious balance emerged between gratitude for the dragon's guardianship and anxiety over its unpredictability. As the weeks turned to months, a more complex tapestry formed in King's Landing. Daily life began to resemble that of a bustling city once more. Street vendors hawked roasted meat and cheap ale, while children laughed in muddy streets, oblivious to the weight of history that pressed on their parents. The amphitheater thrummed with constant debate, shows of music and dancing, and visiting merchants from all corners of Westeros, each adding their voices to this newborn system. Some even called it a parliament of the people, though that term felt grandiose to most. They simply called it the Forum. News of expansions reached their ears too. The Riverlands, under the watchful eye of the Tullys, showed interest in sending delegates to the Forum. Lords in the Vale remained skeptical but hadn't interfered. Dorne watched from afar, rarely interfering in the North's politics. The Iron Islands, recently ravaged by internal feuds, had their own reconstruction to worry about. Pockets of chaos persisted across the land, but the Forum had become an undeniable presence, a hub of conversation and negotiation. Then, one summer morning, an unexpected summons arrived from King Bran himself. Maester Jonel delivered a message to Estevan, Lillian, and Bryn. The king wished to hold a grand assembly at King's Landing, inviting representatives from all over Westeros to discuss the future of the realm, and he requested the Forum's cooperation in hosting the event. The Red Keep was still partially in ruins, so Bran proposed using the amphitheater for the gathering, to showcase the new spirit of governance emerging in the city. Liliana's eyes shone with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This could be a monumental step forward, or a catalyst for conflict if certain factions saw it as a challenge to the old ways. Preparations began at once. The amphitheater needed to accommodate many lords, ladies, envoys, and possibly even foreign dignitaries from across the narrow sea. Volunteers set about cleaning and decorating the courtyard. They hung colorful banners from the steel arches, greens, blues, reds, to represent the various regions. They placed fresh rushes on the floor. Artisans fashioned comfortable benches, while stonemasons added a few carved seats at the upper rim for older nobles who might need extra support. The day before the assembly, King Bran arrived with his small retinue, including Tyrion Lannister and Brienne of Tarth. As always, Bran's presence drew curiosity. He was carried in a specially crafted litter, for the Red Keep's staircases were not fully restored. The king looked paler than before, the weight of his visions and knowledge etched into his gaze. Tyrion's hair had taken on more silver strands, and the lines in his face spoke of the burdens of counsel. Brienne, ever the stalwart figure, stood guard, scanning the amphitheater with keen vigilance. Liliane, Bryn, and Estevan greeted them. The Triad updated Bran on the Forum's progress, the trade partnerships, the sewer reconstruction, the new wave of illnesses they were battling. Bran listened with a kind of distant empathy, nodding occasionally, as if he saw more than what they told him. Tyrion peppered them with questions, praising the Forum's record-keeping. He joked that such documentation could make the dusty old scribes in Old Town quite jealous. That evening, the city reverberated with the clamor of arrivals. Lords from the Westerlands, the Stormlands, the Vale. Envoys from the Reach, from the Riverlands, even from some free cities across the sea. Tents rose up around King's Landing, each bearing the sigil of a house or a foreign banner. For many, it was their first time witnessing the People's Forum. Some were openly hostile, others curious, a few genuinely supportive. The tension in the air was thick with expectation. At dawn, the great assembly began. Trumpets, or what passed for trumpets, in a city still rebuilding, blared softly. The amphitheater filled, row by row, with a kaleidoscope of garments and sigils. Common folk, who normally sat in those benches to speak their minds, found themselves sharing space with lords draped in silks and velvets. The swirl of perfume and sweat mingled in the summer heat. King Bran was seated in the central dais on a plain wooden chair, refusing any elevated throne. Tyrion and Brienne stood close by. The triad took their places as well, not in regal fashion but among the circle, distinguishing themselves only by small badges indicating their role in the forum's council. Liliane spoke first, her voice tremulous but determined. She welcomed the assembly to King's Landing, acknowledging the tragedy that had befallen the city and how they were now forging a new path. She thanked the forum's thousands of participants, from the simplest potter to the traveling merchant, for holding together a city that might have otherwise collapsed in on itself. She then introduced King Bran as an ally in these efforts, not an overlord. Bran's pale gaze swept over the crowd. He spoke softly but clearly about the realm's fractures, the lingering scars of war, and his vision of a future where each region retained its autonomy, but worked together through mutual trust. He acknowledged that the People's Forum was an experiment, imperfect, evolving, and hard for some to accept. Yet, in a realm tired of bloodshed, any new approach deserved consideration. He invited all present to share their thoughts openly. The next hours were a tumult of debate. Noble voices rose in protest. How could a city of commoners dare to govern without fealty to a lord's command? Others, mostly from the battered riverlands, supported the forum's approach, seeing it as a shield against future devastation. The lords from the Vale were divided. Some wanted more direct influence if they were to support this new system. Others scorned the entire idea. An envoy from the free city of Pentos watched quietly, wearing an inscrutable half-smile. At times the discussions grew heated, personal insults flung across the amphitheater. Bryn, fearing violence, tensed, ready to call for calm. Yet each time the tension peaked. Overhead the sound of massive wings or a distant roar reminded everyone that the city's monstrous guardian was near. The knowledge that Drogon might swoop down at the first sign of a brawl tempered tempers, ensuring that words rather than swords remained the tools of contention. Midday turned to afternoon. Food and drink were served in a makeshift banquet. Estevan, in his element, skillfully mediated smaller side discussions. He tried to charm reluctant lords with trade deals, subtle bribes of new markets for their goods. Liliane conversed with maesters about how to prevent further outbreaks of disease and how a citywide sanitation plan could become a model for other towns. Bryn hovered near trouble spots, using his stature and soldiers' bearing to keep hotheads from flaring into aggression. As evening light bathed the amphitheater in gold, Tyrion stepped forward. He proposed that each region send 1 or 2 delegates to regularly attend sessions of the People's Forum, effectively creating a realm-wide body of discussion. This was not a replacement for local rule or the monarchy, but an addition, a place where decisions that affected all of Westeros might be debated by representatives of the actual populace, not just by high lords. A cacophony of reactions rippled through the amphitheater, from outraged shouts to enthusiastic applause. Then, something unexpected happened. A young woman wearing the sigil of House Mormont rose. She introduced herself as Lyra Mormont, a cousin to the now-deceased Lady Lyanna Mormont. With a voice that carried the clarity of conviction, she recounted how the North had suffered greatly from the wars against the Night King and then the strife in the South. She argued that the North had once sworn fealty to the Iron Throne out of necessity. Now, perhaps they could remain part of the realm through mutual agreement, aided by the forum's structure. Her words resonated with many, a sign that old alliances could be reimagined, not severed. The day concluded with no final resolution, no sweeping reformation or grand decree, but a sense of cautious momentum. The Great Assembly would continue into the following days. For once, the lords and ladies had to adapt to the forum's style of open discourse, a process that many found strange or tedious. But the tides of conversation were changing. They saw that the People's Forum wasn't a mob. It was an organized, if unruly, deliberative body that included the wealthy, the humble, and those in between. More and more, the crowd's energy leaned toward forging some lasting framework. That evening, lanterns glowed around the amphitheater. Music filled the courtyard, a motley band of fiddlers and pipers whose tunes carried a hopeful lilt. Delegates and commoners mingled in a nighttime market, sampling spiced wine, warm bread, and roasted meats. Tales circulated of how the city had risen from ashes. People from distant corners of the realm rubbed shoulders with those who once had been dismissed as mere rabble. Tyrion walked through the crowd, exchanging jests and snippets of conversation, while Brienne stood watch, protective but calm. Bran, weary from the day, had retired to a quieter corner, though he seemed to see everything even in his withdrawal. At some point after midnight, a cry rang out. A watchman on a tower had spotted fires in the distance, toward the east. Alarm spread through the gathering. Estevan and Bryn rushed to investigate, climbing a half-repaired staircase in the Red Keep to gain a better vantage. From there, they could see faint glows flickering in the darkness beyond the city walls. Torches, perhaps, or burning farmsteads. The watchman, trembling slightly, claimed it looked like a large group of armed men approaching by the Rosby Road. Anxious rumors swiftly filled the streets. Had Lord Ellyn returned with an army? Were Sellswords planning an attack? Did some enemies aim to sabotage the Great Assembly? People scrambled for any available weapons. Word reached Liliane, who hurried to set up a makeshift triage station at the amphitheater's edge just in case. Bran, advised by Tyrion, ordered the city guard to prepare barricades while urging calm. The delegates from distant lands looked on with apprehension. They had come for diplomacy, not war. Tension mounted as the fires drew closer. Then a stroke of fortune. Scout riders sent out by the Forum returned with an update. The armed men were not an attacking force but a caravan of laborers and displaced villagers who had been threatened by bandits. They carried torches and pitchforks, escorting wagons and families seeking refuge. Relieved, the city opened its gates. The newly arrived throng, ragged and exhausted, poured into King's Landing. Their leader, a woman named Senna, explained that they had heard of the People's Forum, a place that offered safety. They'd chosen to leave their threatened hamlets, traveling by night to avoid raids. The arrival put strain on the city's resources, but also underscored the Forum's expanding reputation. People from the countryside believed that if they could just reach King's Landing, they would find not a tyrant's throne, but a circle of voices that might help them. The delegates at the Great Assembly witnessed firsthand the desperation of these refugees. Many of those lords and ladies who had scoffed at the Forum's idealism felt a pang of responsibility, or at least recognized that ignoring such migration could lead to worse chaos. Over the next several days, the Great Assembly resumed with even greater urgency. Tyrion, drawing on his administrative background, proposed a realm-wide relief effort. Each region would commit to taking in a certain number of displaced families and assisting them with land or work, while the People's Forum coordinated the logistics. The concept of forcibly moving commoners was not new. Lords often relocated peasant populations in times of war, but this was different. It aimed to do so through negotiation and voluntary offers. Some delegates saw it as a burden, others saw it as a moral imperative, and still others recognized an opportunity to repopulate war-torn lands. Debate raged, but by the Assembly's close, a tentative agreement emerged. The Forum would help match refugees to regions that needed manpower, or had spare land, with King Bran's blessing ensuring no one lord exploited the arrangement as a power grab. This approach, unthinkable under the old feudal norms, stirred a mixture of hope and wariness. Liliane and Estevan found themselves at the center of the administration, drafting rosters of families, collecting their skills, and aligning them with potential hosts. Bryn, meanwhile, worked with the city guard and the Forum's volunteer militias to keep the peace. All the while, eyes remained on the sky, for if a violent faction tried to sabotage the Assembly, Drogon's intervention might again be the final deterrent. When the Great Assembly ended, many delegates left King's Landing with newly inked pacts, trade deals, or agreements to send representatives back to the Forum in a few months' time. Not all were satisfied. Some departed with bitter grumbles about how the realm was turning upside down. But they had come, and they had seen the city's transformation in action. In the weeks after, life resumed a semblance of normalcy. The Triad took stock of what had changed. A sense of legitimacy had grown around the People's Forum. King Bran had effectively recognized it as a pan-realm institution. The success of that notion depended on continued cooperation, but it was a milestone. The city, though still partially ruined, buzzed with a fresh current of optimism. More refugees arrived, guided by rumors of open arms and new beginnings, straining resources but also injecting vitality into neighborhoods once left abandoned. Liliane discovered that her healing talents were in greater demand than ever. She organized new medical teams, taught younger apprentices the basics of herbs and wound care, and coordinated with any maester or learned healer passing through. Her dream was to found a formal hospital in the city, something that went beyond a ramshackle infirmary. The Forum discussed the idea passionately, though cost and location were concerns. Perhaps a section of the old Red Keep could be repurposed. Bryn, always mindful of security, oversaw the training of a more disciplined city watch. They still lacked the armor and arms of the old Kingsguard, but they were numerous and motivated. He recruited honest folk and instructed them in basic tactics, crowd control, and conflict resolution. Some ex-soldiers joined, still haunted by the war, wanting to protect rather than destroy. As for Estevan, he flitted between King's Landing and other regions, forging new deals, shipping out goods in exchange for stone, grain, livestock, or whatever else the city needed. He came back from each trip with fresh stories of how the forum's reputation spread, how some lords sneered but others listened, how some free cities across the sea viewed these developments with curiosity or even admiration. Meanwhile, beyond the immediate purview of the forum, rumors abounded of scattered mercenary bands, rogue lords, and opportunistic raiders who exploited the realm's fluid state of power. Some claimed that Lord Ellen was rallying a coalition of minor houses disgruntled by the forum's existence. Whispered tales spoke of clandestine meetings in the countryside, clandestine alliances forged out of fear that the monarchy and a forum together would erode noble privileges. The Triad took these rumors seriously. They met in the amphitheater late one night, discussing how to address potential revolt without spurring further violence. The only certain advantage they held was Drogon's overshadowing presence. But they hoped to avoid a situation where the dragon's fire would be unleashed again. Then, one sultry afternoon, an ominous sign appeared in the sky, a shape that looked almost like Drogon but smaller, with tattered greenish scales. The creature soared near the city walls, letting out shrill cries that sent waves of panic through the inhabitants. Some recognized it from stories Estevan had told of the wyvern-like beasts that attacked brigands on the road. Whether it had followed the trade caravans or merely roamed near the city by chance, it was now here, circling low with an air of menace. Archers on the walls readied their bows, not sure if they had any real chance against such a creature. Shouts rang out across the streets as people scrambled for cover. Suddenly, Drogon himself appeared from the west. A roar of fury rolled across the rooftops as he slammed through the sky like a black storm, enormous wings carrying him toward the intruder. The smaller beast whirled with surprising agility, letting out a piercing shriek. The two creatures clashed in midair over Blackwater Bay, tangling in a flurry of claws and snapping jaws. Drogon dwarfed the wyvern, but it was swift and vicious, slashing at his flank. The city watched in breathless terror, unsure if their protector would prevail. The battle raged. Drogon's fire billowed forth in a searing column, narrowly missing the smaller creature, which folded its wings and dove. It latched onto Drogon's side with savage desperation. The black dragon roared in pain, twisting to fling the beast off. They spiraled downward, dangerously close to the water, then rose again in a violent dance. Scales and blood rained into the bay. Onlookers at the dock saw the water churn, tinted red. At last, with a shuddering snap of his jaws, Drogon clamped down on the smaller beast's neck. A final shriek tore through the air. Drogon released the limp body, which tumbled into the bay with a colossal splash. For a moment he hovered above the water, breathing ragged plumes of smoke, then flapped unsteadily toward the city. Alarm spread that Drogon might be badly wounded. The black dragon's flight was labored, and rivulets of dark blood streaked his scales. He managed to land outside the city walls, collapsing into a field. Soldiers and townsfolk rushed forward, drawn by the instinct to help, though no one knew how to treat a wounded dragon. The thrashing of his tail and the feral gleam in his eyes warned them to keep a safe distance. Liliane arrived on the scene, heart pounding. She had tended to men, women, even horses, but a dragon? She approached cautiously, accompanied by a small retinue carrying water, bandages, and herbs. Drogon snarled, a warning that shook her to the core. Yet she pressed closer, kneeling at a safe distance, hands outstretched in a gesture of calm. With each laborious breath Drogon took, dust and smoke puffed from his nostrils. He watched Liliane warily, his black pupils dilated. She murmured soft words, not so much expecting him to understand as to convey gentleness. The deep lacerations along his flank and neck oozed blood that hissed when it hit the grass, steaming as if it were still superheated from his internal fire. The onlookers kept a wide berth, uncertain if the next moment might bring a blast of flame. Liliane signaled for water, directing her helpers to approach in slow, deliberate steps. As they drew near, Drogon snarled again, but this time less fiercely. Carefully, Liliane began washing the wounds with water, trying to clear away dirt and scale fragments. The dragon shuddered, letting out a growl that sounded almost like a groan of pain. She then applied a salve made of cooling herbs, though she knew this was likely a meager remedy for such a colossal being. Every movement had to be slow, cautious, done in plain sight so he wouldn't perceive a threat. Hours passed as she and her small team ministered to the dragon. Bryn stood nearby, ensuring no one acted rashly, while Estevan coordinated a perimeter to keep the curious at bay. The city held its collective breath. From the walls, children peered wide-eyed at the sight of their monstrous guardian lying injured on the ground. Smoke coiled from Drogon's nostrils, diminishing in intensity as exhaustion took hold. At length, darkness fell, and Liliane insisted they keep a night watch. She would not leave Drogon's side, rotating with other healers. The dragon seemed to slip into a restless slumber, twitching occasionally, as though fighting memories of the aerial battle. Liliane could do little more than ensure his wounds remained clean, hoping his natural draconic resilience would carry him through. Over the next days, Drogon gradually stabilized. He occasionally roused, lifting his head with a rasping growl, and sometimes managing a weak blast of flame that barely singed the grass. Liliane's healers discovered that dragons, much like humans, benefited from cleanliness and the application of certain herbs to reduce infection, though the scale of everything required creativity and courage. By the week's end, Drogon was standing, albeit shakily, occasionally stretching his wings with visible pain. He tested short flights, lurching into the air for seconds before landing again with a grunt. The city watched this slow recovery with mingled relief and alarm. Even wounded, Drogon remained formidable, a black leviathan capable of incinerating entire battalions. In the Forum, discussions abounded on what this meant. If other draconic creatures roamed Westeros or Essos, would they threaten King's Landing again? If Drogon's power was not absolute, how would that affect the delicate balance of deterrence that kept the city safe from hostile lords? Some believed this was a warning that they could no longer rely solely on him. Others saw it as a sign that the world was indeed changing, magic stirring in unknown corners. Perhaps other dragons might appear, or perhaps this was merely one stray wyvern that had ventured too far from its lair. Amid the uncertainty, the city's communal spirit grew stronger. People felt gratitude, both for Drogon's protection and for Liliane's efforts to save him. A new sense of kinship formed between the city and the dragon, as though he was not just a terrifying guardian, but also a living being susceptible to danger, in need of their help. Offerings of food and water were left near the field where Drogon rested. Children sneaked closer than they should, wide-eyed with a mixture of fear and fascination, until scolded away by concerned parents. Drogon's slow convalescence stretched into weeks. By then, the city had adapted. Liliane split her time between the dragon's fieldside station and her normal healing duties. Bryn and Estevan coordinated daily tasks, from patrolling for raiders to distributing the produce that had come in from the Reach. The People's Forum continued to debate policy, from how to handle the steady flow of refugees to the possibility of forging a permanent alliance with other major cities in Westeros. The presence of so many new arrivals pushed the city's boundaries outward. Makeshift huts sprang up beyond the walls, forming nascent neighborhoods that the Forum tried to incorporate, ensuring they too had a voice. Eventually, Drogon began to venture further. One morning, the watchers in the field awoke to find he had vanished during the night, leaving behind deep gouges in the earth where he'd launched himself. Alarm spread briefly. Was he gone for good? But the next day he returned, bearing fresh scars and an air of regained confidence, gliding in to settle atop a broken tower of the Red Keep. He stretched his wings wide as if to remind the city of his majestic presence. A collective sigh of relief pulsed through the populace. Their dark protector was back where he belonged, still wounded, but healing. Life in King's Landing resumed its tireless churn. More travelers arrived, more deals were made, more disputes broke out and were settled in open forum sessions. The Triad grew more adept at managing the chaotic dance of voices. They implemented a procedure for larger proposals, posting them publicly, allowing a set number of days for debate, then calling a vote by raised hands or tokens. It was a far cry from the old monarchy, but it worked well enough that cynics began to see the Forum was neither a passing fad nor an ungovernable mob. The city's revitalization stood as living proof that an open council, guided by necessity and watched over by a living dragon, could endure. Of course, no peace lasts forever. Trouble brewed in the realm, from the lingering ambitions of disgruntled lords to the possibility of new draconic threats. The city's expansions also brought friction, conflicts over land use, resource distribution, and cultural clashes among refugees from different regions or even different continents. Yet, each time tensions rose, the People's Forum stood as a space where grudges could be aired, compromises sought, and communities stitched together from the tapestry of differences. A single monstrous throne of swords had once overshadowed King's Landing. Now a circle of benches, hammered from that throne's melted metal, sheltered an ever-growing chorus of voices. Every day, those voices shaped a future that few in Westeros could have dreamed of before Daenerys Targaryen's final, fateful act of destruction and Drogon's unexpected gesture of creation. Season after season, the city's face changed. Streets that had lain in rubble were cleared. Simple but solid buildings rose where charred ruins had once stood. Shops and taverns opened in the quieter quarters, while the Forum's district buzzed night and day. Some adventurous souls scouted the city's outskirts for farmland, building small settlements that fed the metropolis. The Triad welcomed new leaders into the Forum as they emerged. Eloquent farmers, thoughtful scribes, charismatic tradesmen, keeping the city's governance dynamic and reflective of the people's shifting needs. In moments of reflection, Liliane sometimes thought of the old woman who had touched the cold steel benches on that first night of the Forum's transformation. She wondered if that woman still lived, or if she had passed on, comforted by the knowledge that something hopeful had bloomed in the ashes. Bryn remembered his fallen comrades, silently vowing never again to let the city be consumed by the flames of a single tyrant's ambition. Estevan, in his quieter moments, wondered if the ephemeral dream of a better world might truly take root. Each had their own ghosts to placate. Each found solace in the collective voice that rose day by day from the amphitheater, forging unity out of chaos. Time, as it always does, carried them forward. Children born after the siege grew up hearing stories of dragons, one that destroyed and one that rebuilt, but in truth, it was the same dragon. They also heard tales of a forum where even the poorest could speak, where lords and small folk might sit side by side, deciding the fate of a realm. Tales spread throughout Westeros, crossing the seas to Essos, reaching distant lands that had never cared for the politics of the Seven Kingdoms. Some travelers came to see it with their own eyes, to stand in that circle of steel and marvel at the transformation. Others came as spies, or skeptics, or with hidden agendas, yet they too were woven into the tapestry. At last, the day came when Drogon soared above the city without bearing the visible scars of his battle. His powerful silhouette etched itself against the midday sun, casting a broad shadow over the Forum. People paused to watch, reminded anew of his fearsome splendor. He let out a roar that echoed between the newly raised rooftops and the old towers alike. It was neither an announcement of conquest nor a mourning cry, but something akin to a draconic declaration of presence, a living symbol that from the fires of destruction, a new future had been forged. And below, in the heart of King's Landing, that future took the shape not of an iron seat meant for one, but of a wide circle meant for all who chose to step into it and speak. In the months that followed, no single crisis defined the People's Forum. Instead, it became a series of continual negotiations, distributing farmland to new arrivals, disciplining a group of rowdy mercenaries, discussing trade routes with bravos, organizing a citywide festival to commemorate those who had died in the siege. When an exiled lord tried to stir a rebellion in a far province, the Forum dispatched envoys to mediate, and King Bran sent knights to maintain the peace. When a merchant ship arrived bearing exotic spices from the Summer Isles, the Forum debated how to distribute them and whether to build a new trade port to accommodate larger vessels. A new chapter opened when a cluster of northern lords, including some from House Mormont and House Reed, settled in the city for a season, curious to see how the Forum's principles might benefit their own domains. Tensions inevitably arose. Some northern ways clashed with southern customs, but the circle of steel benches gave them space to confront their differences without drawing swords. Out of these discussions emerged the notion that other major cities, like White Harbor or Old Town, might establish their own local forums, with ties to the central one in King's Landing. An audacious idea, but one that gradually took root among certain visionary leaders. Simultaneously, a quiet shift was happening in the psychology of the city's inhabitants. When disputes flared, they no longer asked, "Which lord do we appeal to?" Or, "Will the king issue a decree?" But rather, "When can we bring this to the forum?" Or, "Who will speak for us at the forum?" That subtle change in mindset did more than any grand proclamation to erode the old sense of absolute feudal hierarchy. It gave people a direct stake in decisions that shaped their lives, and while that stake might be tenuous, it was more than they had ever possessed before. Nonetheless, it was still Westeros, a land that had known countless betrayals and catastrophes. Even as hope flourished, storms gathered at the edges. Some said that a fleet of ironborn raiders under a fanatical captain was terrorizing the western coasts, refusing to acknowledge any new order. Others spread word of shadowy priests from Essos arriving in secret, carrying relics of dark magic. Travelers from the south brought tales of an ominous plague creeping through the disputed lands across the narrow sea. These distant threats loomed, pressing on the fragile peace. Against that broader backdrop, King Bran's health began to decline more visibly. His once regular visits to the forum grew sporadic, replaced by messages delivered through Tyrion or Maester Jonel. People wondered if the burdens of the realm were too great for him, or if the powers that allowed him to see beyond the present were taking their toll. Regardless, the monarchy remained supportive of the forum, if only because it provided a stable structure that reduced the likelihood of endless rebellions. Bran's acceptance gave the forum time to strengthen its roots. Yet some lords whispered that upon Bran's death, the question of succession would test the realm again. Would the forum anoint another king? Or would the monarchy fade altogether? Among the common folk, these political speculations were overshadowed by day-to-day survival and slowly improving conditions. More small businesses opened around the city, from cobblers to coopers, each paying a small share into the civic fund. The newly cleared sewers reduced outbreaks of disease. Schools, informal at first, started teaching reading and basic math to children who once would have labored in fields or workshops without any education. The forum financed these schools in part, seeing literacy as vital to an engaged populace. Old illusions of greatness, marble statues of past kings, massive tournaments of splendor, had little place in a city focused on rebuilding from the ground up. But a new form of pride emerged, a sense that anyone who worked hard, who spoke at the forum, who contributed to the city's tapestry, was part of something larger than themselves. Drogon often perched on the highest remaining spire of the Red Keep, like a sentinel. Children would giggle at the sight of him adjusting his wings in a lazy stretch, as if bored by the bustle below. Adults still felt a tremor of awe whenever the massive shape took flight, crossing the sky in silent arcs. His wounded flank had mostly healed, leaving only faint scars across the scales. Memories of the day he nearly fell into Blackwater Bay lingered, but he seemed as strong as ever, a creature of myth who had somehow chosen to linger in the realm of men. As the years progressed, and they did progress, for time moved on even in this once ruined city, a new generation reached young adulthood having known no other system than the forum. They grew up hearing elders talk of the Iron Throne as a relic of the past, a seat that had once dominated their world but now existed only in melted fragments, repurposed into the very benches they sat on. Those benches shaped their reality of communal discourse and open debate. While the monarchy still officially reigned through King Bran, for most daily matters, people turned to the forum circle. The notion of a single ruler commanding absolute authority seemed distant, almost mythical. In that sense, Drogon's act of melting the Iron Throne had achieved a symbolic resonance more powerful than any dragonfire used in battle. It had severed the realm from its iconic seat of power, leaving space, both literal and figurative, for a new arrangement to emerge. Daenerys Targaryen's dream of breaking the wheel had not come to pass in the way she had intended. Her descent into tyranny had nearly destroyed that dream. Yet Drogon, through an impulse that might have been grief or a deeper draconic understanding, had reshaped the remnants of that seat into a forum that breathed life into the realm's small folk. The dream, battered and re-envisioned, lived on. Some bards penned verses about this transformation, weaving Daenerys' tragic arc and Drogon's subsequent creation into epic ballads. They sang of how the queen's final act had been undone by her own dragon, forging from her ashes a new dawn. The People's Forum itself became a legend in the making, a story told in taverns from Winterfell to Sunspear. Traveling minstrels would sometimes arrive, hoping to see the famed circle of steel with their own eyes. Some left disappointed that it was just benches in a courtyard rather than a shining palace of wonders. Others stayed, enthralled by the raw vitality of a place where debate happened freely under the open sky. Life pressed on in increments of small victories and small defeats. Some days, the forum voted to allocate more resources to schooling, and the next day they might argue about raising the civic share to pay for repairs on a collapsed bridge. Factions formed around certain charismatic speakers, and rivalries brewed. But the system, messy though it was, continued to function. Lilian, Bryn and Estevan, aging but steadfast, watched as new voices rose up to join the governance. They learned to step back at times, letting the next generation gain experience. In the end, the People's Forum was not a utopia. It faced dissent, corruption, power plays, and the constant threat of external forces. Yet it was also a place of daily miracles, the miracle of people speaking openly, negotiating their lives without being trampled by the whims of a distant lord on a sword-forged throne. The miracle of seeing a city once burned to cinders now bustling with renewed purpose. And perhaps the greatest miracle of all was that a dragon, once the embodiment of conquest, had become an unlikely catalyst for this fragile but enduring community. On the anniversary of the forum's founding, crowds gathered in the amphitheater to celebrate with music, food, and speeches. Children garlanded the statue of joined hands with flowers, while traveling performers staged reenactments of how Drogon had melted the throne. Some in the audience who remembered the terror of those days shivered at the theatrical flames, but they also cheered when the molten metal gave way to the creation of the circle. Then, in the twilight, a hush settled over the forum. People turned their eyes skyward, hoping to see the living symbol of their story. As if summoned by collective will, Drogon soared overhead, black wings outlined against the purple dusk, letting out a single, resonant roar. A roar that said, in the only language dragons possess, that the saga was not over, that the realm continued to evolve under his watchful gaze. Long after darkness fell, torches still burned in the amphitheater, voices still rose in passionate debate, and the circle of steel remained filled with the footsteps of dreamers and pragmatists alike. For all the uncertainties that lay ahead, for all the wars that might yet come, for all the schemes that mortal hearts might devise, the People's Forum stood, day after day, a living testament to the idea that even in Westeros, a land scarred by centuries of brutal conflict, the seeds of a better order could take root in the ashes, guarded by dragon's fire, and fueled by the voices of the many-eyed crags. And if that idea could survive here, in the once ruined cradle of kings, perhaps it could survive anywhere. Do I know I'm not solved?